Welcome to the 31st Annual IUN Forum on Abuse and Neglect. My name is Julie Villarreal. I am the Senior Director for the Villages of Northwest Indiana. I am joined today by Sandy Runkle of Prevent Child Abuse Indiana.
Thanks, Julie. It's my great honor to introduce both Natalie and Jay. So this morning, Natalie Lukic, she's a licensed mental health counselor and LGBTQ program coordinator, therapist, and supervisor of Resource Family Support Services for Crown Counseling. She's a proud graduate of Purdue University Northwest with degrees in sociology and clinical mental health counseling. Her theoretical base for therapy is cognitive behavioral, but she also utilizes expressive arts for which she holds certification and other methods in her practice. She is founder and co-facilitator of an Affirming LGBTQ+ support group, and she's a proud adoptive mother of a teen daughter whom she adopted through the Department of Child Services. And now it's also an honor to introduce Jay Watts, who is an Afro-Lachian queer sexuality and diversity scholar. She has a bachelor's degree in social studies education from the University of Louisville, Master of Arts in Human Services, Student Personnel Services in Higher Education from Eastern Kentucky University, a Master of Education in Cultural Foundations of Education, and is in the process of completing a PhD in mental health with a focus in race, sexuality, and healing from Walden University. They have over a decade in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field with experience in working with numerous K-12 school districts, higher education institutions, and national conferences, amounting to over 60,000 touch points in training. Her research and writing can be found in The Diverse Issues in Higher Education, Encyclopedia of Social Justice and Diversity, Journal of Social Research and Scholar Works, and she also is the proud mother, a board member for the Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana, a community advocate specializing in interpersonal violence prevention and healing, and a consultant for faith and political leaders. And she's also the president and CEO of Diverse Affirm Group. So again, it's my honor to present Natalie and Jay.
How's everybody doing this morning? Hopefully well. I'm going to just get the share screen going here. So I'd like to just start by again saying hi and hope everyone's having a good morning. I'm Natalie Lukic. Again, real quick, I'm a therapist, supervisor, LGBTQ program coordinator from Crown Family Services. I also like to share that I do have a queer kiddo at home, and that's kind of how I got involved with this so needed topic and subject. Jay, would you like to make any opening statements?
Yes, I'm just so excited to be in front of you all today. I would also like to just thank you all for taking the time, but also to acknowledge that we are on land in Indiana and Indianapolis that was previously occupied by several Native and Indigenous tribes. We are in this space where a lot of individuals have either been uprooted from their households or been part of systems of injustices. And we also have a lot of things going on in society right now. So in the spirit of transformative justice and being able to lift those communities up as well, I have to acknowledge that we are sitting on land that also has some pain and trauma involved. So I'm really excited to be in front of you today and going over something that's very important to both Natalie and myself.
So I just wanted to highlight a few discussion guidelines. This is something that we regularly do with our groups when we do groups. I just want us to hopefully recognize and celebrate the many differences that exist between and among us, acknowledges that these privileges or these differences have led to varying levels of access to power and privilege, as Jay has already highlighted with our opening remarks, communicating authentically without harming, using inclusive language. So for those of you that don't know, that would include using pronouns that a person is asking us to use, and also names that people are asking us to use. Please speak from your own personal experience, understanding, and feelings. We want to recognize and respect the presence of many perspectives and truths. So this is definitely want to keep this out of a place of judgment. And although we can't guarantee confidentiality in this group, I do hope that we can provide that for each other, so this can be a safe space for us to discuss these things, because we want this to be the place that you ask those questions that you need to ask or that you feel like you want answers for. All right, so going into the next section, I just wanted to give everybody a basic rundown. I don't know, where you guys are at as far as language is concerned, but I always like to throw this out there just because I feel like sometimes there's some new things that people might not know. Jay, of course, feel free to chime in here too if you have any extras. And I do like to say that, I'm not going to read these all out to you, but I do like to say that I usually ask my kiddo because they're going to give me the most updated terminology for things. And just also to say that, like, sometimes if you don't know or if you don't understand a term, asking respectfully is really the best way to understand where a person is coming from and how they would like to be identified or described. So, but the only one that I think that maybe some people don't really know is maybe the pansexual. I don't know if that's something that a lot of people know, that the adding of the prefix pan tends to mean, as with sexuality and gender, tends to mean that it's attraction or gender regardless of identity or expression. So in the pansexual way, that means a sexual orientation that refers to people who are attracted to individuals regardless of their gender or gender expression. So I have a lot of people that say in group, they say hearts, not parts, when it comes to being pansexual. I love that expression. I think it's really sweet, because it really applies and it describes it really well. So that person would be, open to liking whoever their heart feels like they want to like, regardless of their gender or gender expression. So the only other one maybe would be the asexual, sexual orientation, which individuals aren't sexually attracted. I think that's important to note the difference between sexual and romantic attraction, but they're not sexually attracted to anybody regardless of gender roles, gender identity, but they maybe have romantic attraction. And I think that's kind of a misconception about people that are asexual, is that they don't have romantic attractions, and that's not often true. I mean, it could be true, but most of the time not true, at least in my experience. So moving on to the next one, we've got some gender terms. I think this is where people get a little bit more, where they don't know the terms as well, because they're kind of newer as far as people knowing them. And so we have cisgender, which is what I would say I am. I'm a person who was, when I was born, the doctor said it's a girl. And when I was old enough to understand what gender meant to me, I said, I agree. And so that is what a cisgender person is. That term has had to be created because of the cisgender normativeness that we've had in our culture. We didn't have a term for that because it was just assumed that everyone was cisgender. So there was no term in that. But I think in the last 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, I don't have an exact date on that, but that term was created to describe that because there was no term for that. So a gender independent, gender creative, gender expansive, again, all of these things are going to be language that's changing and evolving and growing over time, and asking the person if you're not sure, but that might mean that they don't conform to society's expectation of gender expression. Gender fluid is usually somebody who would say that their gender identification and presentation shifts. So they might express their gender externally one way one day and another way another day, depending on how they're feeling. So a person who is transgender, their gender identity differs from the societal expectations for their physical sex that the doctor or they were assigned at birth. And then androgynous is mixed or neutral gender. Bigendered and pangendered, there's that pan again. So gender and gender expression, combinations of those things, right? Gender queer, and I know a lot of people, and I'm old school, so I'm a 47-year-old person, and so when I see the word queer, it still is it gets me a little twingy because it was such a negative thing when I was growing up. And so when I see this word, I have to stop and think, how is it being used? Is it being used appropriately? And so for somebody to describe themselves as genderqueer is certainly appropriate, because that word has somewhat been reclaimed as an empowerment word. And so if someone is saying that, they are not necessarily degrading themselves by saying that. Yes, Jay.
I echo that. Myself that identifies as queer. Queer has been a term that has been reclaimed. and definitely utilized not only just in scholarship, but also in identity as a reclaimed word to bring empowerment. You can think of it almost as an umbrella term. So when we talk about the queer community, we're talking about all the umbrellas of the LGBTQ plus communities. Now, yes, there still is a lot of pain associated to that word as well too, but that's also one of the reasons why, especially in the 80s, when you start seeing the reclamation of that word queer. So queer can be utilized in a gender specific aspect, but also sexual orientation, romantic as well too. So definitely, for sure.
Thanks, Jay, for the input. And one of our panels is also a product of the 80s like me, and I definitely had different experiences with that word, but also kind of understands the empowerment that has come with the reclamation of that word. So, and then agender, again, just like asexuality, no felt sense of gender identity, but on the gender side versus the sexuality side. And then we have this beautiful little kind of overlapping chart. Again, it's just for reference. There's going to be all kinds of beautiful and glorious variations of what this might look like for a person. But it's kind of good sometimes, I think, to help us organize the, materials in our brain to have little charts. So I do like it, though. I think it's really good at showing how things kind of overlap and overcross. I love the genderbread person, and I like to see, I don't know if it's something that Jay would be willing to do, but I would be willing to put myself on this chart, just kind of illustrate where I sit with this chart. The reason that I really love it is because it is a scale. It is not a black and white, one or the other. And you notice that there's a starting point that just increases versus, again, one end or the other. The other thing that I like to notice about it, and a way that I like that it helps us kind of like describe things, is that it's got everything broken down. Gender identity and gender expression are broken up as separately. Sexual attraction, romantic attraction is broken up separately. Biological sex, and then also the great little illustration about how expression is on the outside. Identity is something that is in our brain, could also be in our heart. Attraction is in our heart. And then we have biological sex, and how it kind of describes how those things are all part of a human person as a whole, but that they also are different components of how we kind of identify or what a person might feel like, as a whole. So looking at gender identity, if I was going to put myself on here, I would say that I'm pretty far to the right on the womanness scale for my identity. Gender expression, today I'm actually wearing a dress, and I think in our society that is considered to be a feminine thing. So for today, my gender expression would be pretty far on the right, but typically isn't so far on the right. It's more in the middle and maybe a little bit more on the masculine scale. And then my biological sex, for that one, I identify with the femaleness. So again, parts, not hearts, but on that part, I'm in the femaleness scale, pretty far on the right. For sexual attraction, and again, I want you guys to notice that there's a nobody on the left, so that might be for somebody who would identify as asexual. It might not be. It depends on how they identify and how they describe their own sexuality. But for me, on the female scale, I'd say I'm a little bit on there, a little bit over to the right. Masculine scale, definitely on the right. Romantically attracted to, definitely higher on the female scale. So I can definitely feel myself being romantically attracted to woman or femininity. And definitely, I am married to a man, so I'm hoping that I'm romantically attracted, at least to my husband, right? And so definitely far over on that. But I also want to point out the femininity and the masculinity, because there are people that are pangender, and so that person might not identify as a woman or a female, but their presentation of the femininity might be something that somebody might be romantically attracted to. So that's the other brilliant thing about the scale. Jay, I don't know if you're willing to put yourself on there.
Sure.
Okay.
And also a little bit of a backstory of this genderbread person.
Great.
You can find this on, it's pronounced metrosexual.com. There are different versions of this genderbread person, and they update it maybe every year, every 2 years, because identities and naming change. And it's so good to understand that as well too. Even this term biological sex is something that is contested in the sexologist circles when it comes to this term, because biological sex is murky. We have individuals that are intersex. They're born with multiple genitalias, and coercively were assigned a sex before they were able to consent. So that is often a very murky territory as well too. So we tend to say, instead of biological sex, we tend to say sex assigned at birth. So even that has been updated. So you can tell that language just evolves, and it really is a test of the time as well too. For my gender identity, I am, probably split down right in the middle. I identify as genderqueer. You're going to see me one moment very feminine, but you may see me also masculine at points as well too. I'm definitely very fluid in my gender expression, meaning that I have no bounds. And I'm totally okay with not being put in a box when it comes to my gender expression. As for my sexual attraction, I am queer, but also pan. I like queer because I just don't like being put in a box. So that is a bit all over. So feminine, masculine, and romantically, that's also on that as well too. If we had time, and maybe we can submit a vocabulary list for you all too, we would go into demisexual and gray A and all these other terms, scoliosexual and all these other aspects. It complicates it, but there's all different types of language and vocabulary. And one of the good things about being an ally and an advocate, but most importantly, an accomplice in this work, meaning that you're willing to put yourself out there to sometimes be in an uncomfortable place, but also utilize your power and privilege as well too to advocate for others. One good thing is you're not required to remember all of these vocabulary words, but one thing that you should feel honest about is if someone comes to you and expresses how they would like to be named and who they are, to be able to be affirming in those moments. Your growth will grow over time. And Natalie will attest that she's always growing in her knowledge and education as well as I am too. So you're never going to be in a space where you're exhausted when it comes to your learning about this. So don't get overwhelmed. Yes. We will definitely be able to send you some information as well too. I know that was in the chat.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks. Yeah, it's always evolving. Again, I keep a little bit more up to date, I think, just by talking to my child, what they'll share with me. They're a teenager. So we got to go with what we can get, right? Okay. So talking about some risk factors for the LGBTQ population. The numbers are always so staggering. And again, with Jay's participation today and help today, we're adding another, a lot of extra layers here for risk factors for teens and for kiddos in your care. And just for those family loved ones, right? So it's the second leading cause of death among young people ages 10 to 24. LGBTQ youth seriously contemplate suicide at least 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. LGBTQ youth are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide. All the suicide attempts made by youth, LGBTQ youth suicide attempts were almost 5 times as likely to require medical treatment. Suicide attempts by LGBTQ youth and questioning youth are 4 to 6 times more likely to result in injury, poisoning, overdose that requires treatment from a doctor compared to their straight peers. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt. I just want to let that sink in for a second and how high of a number that is. 40%. 92% of those individuals reporting having attempted suicide before the age of 25. So for those of you that have kids in your care or are working with kiddos, this is a huge risk factor for kids. LGBTQ youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide. So again, for those of you that have kids in your care, kids on your caseload, kids that you're working with, this is a real risk, it has to be acknowledged and noted for these kids. Because there are going to be, especially if we're working as foster parents or if we're working with DCS, we know that these kids are coming from families that might not be supportive. 1 of 6 students nationwide, grades 9 to 12, seriously considered suicide in the past year. 1 in 6, I have 2 kids in my house right now, you know, that are in grades 9 to 12. And so this statistic, you guys know, I know you all know as caregivers and parents and all of you that are out there, that this is a very scary statistic. And each episode of victimization, such as physical or verbal harassment or abuse, increases the likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times. So whatever positive environment, whatever support, whatever, you know, any kind of like positive interactions that we can do are going to hopefully minimize some of this risk. So there was a local study done, and when I say local, I mean Northwest Indiana. That's where I'm from. I hail from there. Jay, I know you're more the central state. But it was great because there wasn't a lot of data. You know, I don't think there's a lot of data statewide either, but for us, we were able to do it. We are a really heavily populated area. And so we were able to do this in partnership with Praxis and Geminis. So it was in 2014, so it has been a little bit of time since this was done. And I can only assume that numbers would have grown by this point. But I do just want to share a few key points. There was 242 respondents. They were all 18 and over because we, you know, doing surveys with kiddos is really tricky without parental consent. But I think it still is valid and important. 25% of respondents identified as gender nonconforming, and 45% of those gender nonconforming specified gender questioning or gender queer, 20% as transgender men, and 12% as transgender women. So I think what's important there, I know it's kind of not what we're talking about specifically, but is noticing that things are not always as black and white as we want them to be. As Jay was saying, not everything's in a box all the time. And I think if you look at the statistics here, the 45% of gender nonconforming specified gender questioning or gender queer, that boxes are not boxes, right? We don't need to be boxing everything. And again, asking questions respectfully to find out where kiddos and people are at is really the best approach. Anyway, moving on. So 30% of the respondents indicated they experienced a paralyzing, something that interferes with daily activities, which for those of you who are therapists out there understand that that means that is an indicator that there is something definitely wrong. If something's interfering with functioning, then that means that it is a problem that needs to be addressed clinically, right? So it's creating a sense of hopelessness that lasts for at least 2 consecutive weeks in the past 12 months. 34% of the respondents indicated they had seriously considered suicide. So 34% of this 242 people had seriously considered suicide in the past year. 1/3 of the respondents, so 33%, experienced some form of physical abuse, emotional and/or sexual in childhood. 60% were bullied again, physically or through spoken or written assaults while growing up. I do think it's important that I note here that I want to just quell a misconception that people have sometimes about this, is that even though children experience abuse or emotional or sexual trauma as children, there is no correlation between that and sexual identity, sexual orientation, or gender identity. I think sometimes people think they have a misconception that that could be a cause, but I just want to make sure that I'm very clear that there is no correlation between those things. It can make people more vulnerable, just like it can with any other type of risk factor or layer, as again Jay is going to share with us more later. But can make people more vulnerable to having those things happen. But there is not a correlation between those two things as far as cause, right? So I just want to make that 100% clear. 22% were in some course of their adult lives involved in an abusive relationship. Again, vulnerability, some emanating from continued trauma inflicted by non-supportive families or other peers, interactions with society. And 18% saw themselves as victims of hate crimes at some point in their life. This is a figure that suggests to me that crimes against LGBTQ people may be grossly underreported. I mean, if you were queer, would you want to report to the police that you were attacked? I mean, you don't know, especially if someone was, victimizing you as a victim of a hate crime. it's really difficult to report those things in the first place, but then throw on layers of prejudice and other things, and it just makes it even harder. So I mean, I don't know, Jay, if you have any thoughts about that or any of the stuff on this slide. But yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I think all of this is on the slide is amazing, but also a great thing for us to consider when we're wanting to become, you know, allies or advocates or accomplices in this work. And you notice that I talk about like 3 tiers of a way to show up. There's multiple ways to show up for our youth and for our communities on the margins. And, you know, allyship is being able to put yourself in a space of learning. So congratulations, you all. You all have taken a step being part of this and being an ally. But is that enough to be able to support? No, it's not. Being able to advocate means that you're wanting to utilize your voice to be able to enact and affect some change. But being an accomplice, that's really kind of like the coup de grace of this work. But sometimes it's harder to get to because that means you're willing to sacrifice your social standing and your social capital to make things right for communities. And that's where we're struggling with, because some people aren't used to being in uncomfortable spaces. So we're thinking about all of these stats and these surveys and everything, especially when it comes to policing, we also have to think about what are we willing to show up for? How can we show up to mitigate all of these aspects? And Natalie is going to discuss a little bit of some suggestions as well, how to show up to.
So again, I don't want to kill you with stats here, but just to notice this GLSEN Schools Climate Survey, particularly for our youth, these are stats for youth. You can see the numbers, I don't need to read them out for you. I do want to just point out that 75% of the kids that were surveyed that identified as LGBTQ felt unsafe at school. That's a huge number, which, you know, reflects a lot of stuff with grades, attitudes about school, the ability to learn. If we're not feeling safe at school, how do we learn? You know, how do we show up and be present for class if we're worried that, you know, we're going to be harassed at school? So some best practices real briefly. I know you guys can read these out while we're looking at them, and I don't want to hog too much of Jay's time here as we're moving into the second half of our presentation. So we want to work with school administrators, make sure school's a safe and supportive place. I've had really good experiences, particularly, and I do want to call out Morton High School because they've been amazing with my kiddo. But other schools too have been really great. Other schools might be more difficult, and you might really have to try to advocate for your kid. Transgender restrooms and locker room sensitivity. It's really tricky within the school. We know we need to create safe spaces for kids too. But really honoring the child's identified gender, working with your child to find out what they want to disclose at school, private versus public disclosure. It is theirs to tell, it is not ours. But if a child does ask for you for help for that, and whatever we need to do to keep them safe outside of outing them, right? We don't want to be doing that unless that's their wishes. But whatever we can do to keep them safe. Also just wanted to remind you guys that coming out in elementary school or middle school is completely developmentally appropriate. So I had my first boyfriend in kindergarten. And so if your little kiddo is attracted to somebody, I mean, in an age appropriate way, right? If you know, and when I say boyfriend, I mean, I was like playing with his glue and taking his pencils, you know, and those kinds of things. But whatever's appropriate for one kid is appropriate for another developmentally, right? Regardless of who it is that they like, you know. And also just think about when you identify with your gender. Gender is something that people identify with very early. It also can evolve and change over time. So, you know, if you can allow kids space to explore those things, that's really going to be to their benefit. Handling disclosures, again, as you would for any kid. I am very careful about how I disclose things to my kiddos' teachers at school or before they kind of outed themselves to everybody, obviously. But be very careful with that because that can create a sort of chain of effect, you know, that then everybody in the school knows, and that can create a lot of problems. Few, if any, formal resources exist for LGBTQ kids, but there are things you can do. There are ways that you can get, and as we move into the high school section next, there are things that we can do, such as contacting the Gay State Alliance, the ACLU LGBTQ project. There's a lot of things, especially for the higher grades, that you can do to make sure that they're getting affirmative educational resources. And then also being able to form clubs that are supportive and creating a supportive environment within the schools. Gay Straight Alliance is kind of an outdated term, but it really just means an all-inclusive club for everyone that they can do. And I know a lot of the schools in Northwest Indiana do have GSAs. There's a wonderful resource in Indianapolis. There's a person who works at the Indiana Youth Group. If anybody does have a problem, please email me, because they will advocate for you at a school, because it is their legal right to have these types of clubs at the school. So if you need help with that, please email me. We'll be giving that out later. Let's see. Oh yeah. So again, this kind of really highlights especially for a trans kiddo when they're in school, or somebody who's non-binary, if they're walking in school, they go in one bathroom, they're going to get yelled at. If they go in the other one, they might get beaten up, and then they're holding it the whole day because they don't want to go into the bathroom. And how are they showing up for school? That just makes it so difficult to show up and be present. Also, just really quickly to point out, there are scholarships for LGBTQ youth. There are ways to check colleges to make sure that they're affirming and supportive colleges. Not many people take advantage of these scholarships. So if you have a kiddo, make sure that you are doing that for them, because they're highly underused. And there are a lot of opportunities out there for them. You can also look at the Human Rights Campaign's employer database. So if they want to work for a company and they want to make sure that they're advocating and supporting companies that are respectful to them and to their peers or other people, or just, the world, then you want to definitely check those places out to see and be a little more educated about who you're working for, right? Okay. Social media, again, real briefly, that might be the only resource. It might be the only contact. If we have a person who's living in a rural area, the only source of support they might have might be social media. And I know social media is something that we use often as a consequence. We take those away, especially for our kiddos, if we need them to be concentrating on things. But there are definitely moderated things that you can do to make sure that they have access to that source of support. So it's just something to be mindful and thoughtful about when we're using that as a consequence, because if we have an LGBTQ, we don't want them to be completely isolated. Also, doing advocacy for themselves shows a greater outcome for teens, especially if they're allowed to advocate and doing peer support for each other. It just improves outcomes. So I definitely want to encourage you, if that is your kid's jam, definitely to encourage them to do that, because that is going to improve their outcome and the outcome for everyone around them as well. So it's definitely something that I think should be supported and encouraged. Jay, I don't know if you want to help me with some of these best practices. I know we kind of worked on some of these together. But definitely not assuming that all LGBTQAI people have pathology. This is something, as a therapist, I find and I think it's just because people call in for therapy and they say that they're trans, questioning, bi, whatever, and they automatically send them to me. And I'm thinking, is that why they're here? Or is that, are they here for depression? Because they don't need a person who specializes in working with LGBTQ people to see a therapist. If they're here for depression, they could see anyone. So we don't want to assume that. I mean, a lot of kids are perfectly fine being trans, and that's not their issue. So just don't assume that we need to pathologize that. Also, self-expression of identity is essential. So if we have a kid that wants to wear a skirt, and that's who they are, that is essential to well-being. Just like for me, if I was made to wear certain kinds of clothes, I don't even care what those clothes are, but if somebody told me what to wear, I don't feel like I could express myself. I think I would feel, and that as a cis person, and so I think it's really important to note that. And that's, I don't know, Jay, I'm sorry, I'm keep going over you there.
No, it's okay, because I have the ladder in, so you really
Yes.
can kind of power through. It's
Okay. So being mindful of the societal problems that LGBTQ community faces, again, one of those things that we're talking about today, which is so important. And you guys have definitely taken that step by showing up today. And I want to be, just be so thankful about that you guys are here. Being mindful of the problems that, that exist due to specific cultural and sometimes arbitrarily placed norms. So I don't know if you guys have all heard this before, the whole blue and the pink thing, where blue is for boys and pink is for girls, where, before 1950, that was completely the opposite. So Pink was considered to be a masculine color. Well, it was lightened from red to pink for babies because they thought that was a softer version of a strong color for men, which was red, right? But then in 1950, somebody decided to swap that out, and now blue is a masculine thing and pink is a feminine thing. And I think it does a really good job of illustrating how completely arbitrary these things are. You know, the way that we look at some of these standards that we have about what is considered to be masculine or feminine, or what is appropriate for a person to be wearing based on their gender. Gender identity and sexual orientation are going to develop and change over time. I think there's also a misconception about that too. And Jay, that might be something you want to weigh in on, but definitely one morning, they're not going to wake up and say, boop, that's it. You know, I am who I am. Just like every other aspect of who we are, things change and evolve over time. And I think that is really difficult for people, because when we can put things into a box, it helps us feel better, doesn't it? It helps us feel calm and organized in our brain, because that's how we as human beings like to organize things, right? We like to categorize. That's human biology. But it's really important to try to stay out of that kind of thinking. Also, just pointing out that, you know, using affirming language, use of pronouns has huge impact on LGBTQIA people. If it matters to them, it's, you know, my feeling is it doesn't really matter to me, so I might as well just use whatever pronoun that person wants me to use, right? Because it really does matter to them. And also ACA standards say that we comply with these ethical standards. So using pronouns, you know, affirming, those are all the things that the American Counseling and the American Medical Association are saying that we should do. And so we need to, you know, kind of honor and respect that. I like to go with the experts, just like with everything we've been experiencing with COVID. I'm trying to just follow what the experts, because I am certainly not an expert in all of these things, you know, as a cis person, or with COVID, obviously, because I'm not a medical doctor, but I definitely want to listen to the experts, right? So that's what I try to do with this too, with the ACA and the AMA. And doing these things are going to tell that LGBTQ person that you know that you care and that you are trying to understand what they're going through and experiencing. And then we're going to Jay.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I wanted to address one of the questions that Marissa asked. It says, most of the stats make sense considering the issues facing the LGBT community, but is there any explanation for why they are more likely to need medical treatment versus heterosexual youth that attempt suicide? And we'll get into this a bit, but when you're thinking of this, you know, support, unfortunately, LGBTQ plus youth have a lower level or a lower rate of receiving holistic support by the individuals around them. So due to not having that ability to have the support around them, and also the messaging around being LGBTQ plus, that means sometimes there may be compounding factors that may be necessary to receive medical treatment or counseling. We know that resilience is that tool that will help to alleviate a lot of the pain and a lot of the issues that sometimes occur when you're intersecting identities, when you're also, you know, experiencing trauma and pain due to some of those intersecting identities and the oppression that comes from it. Not necessarily the identity itself, but the oppression that comes from it. Some of that can also lead to more needs of making sure that they receive the mental health treatment that they need to be able to be resilient and create to be able to develop the tools needed to get through situations like that. Wanted to do a vocabulary check. And, you know, intersectionality is a term that often is definitely misquoted, misdefined. But I wanted to do a vocabulary check because all of this has to do with serving LGBTQ plus youth. So when I'm talking about intersectionality, and since this is about intersectionality and racial equity within all of the things that Natalie so eloquently mentioned, we're talking about when two or more oppressions overlap in the experiences of an individual or a group, creating interconnected barriers and complex forms of discrimination that can be insidious and covert and compounded. And you'll see this little pictorial illustration on the side that says in the middle, you have this individual's identity. And then outside these factors as well too, social capital based on the individual's identity, the place of residence, the racialization, the occupation, religion, education, etc. There could be more leaves to that flower. But unfortunately, on the outside, there are these factors that are informing those particular systems. They're informing racialization through oppression, through discrimination, through ethnocentrism, through classism. So unfortunately, it is not enough for us to say that there is an LGBTQ plus problem. It is more opportune for us to say that there are so many different interconnecting and interweaving forces that can impact our youth, not just LGBTQ plus, but also beyond that as well too. And I think that sometimes that's hard to also grapple with. It's easy for us, like Natalie said, to compartmentalize identities because it allows us to feel comfortable, especially if it has to intersect with race. In society, although we may think that we are getting beyond it, that we have some accountability that's going on, this is still a painful subject that people are more comfortable ignoring or saying that everyone is the same, so I'm going to treat everyone the same. And that's not possible, because that means that we are divorcing the historical aspect that makes pain real for individuals. That myself as a Black queer woman, I'm Black, my grandfather and my grandmother could not go into town together until 1995 due to being an interracial marriage. That was in the 90s. And I'm from Appalachia, and people will say, well, that's Appalachia. Appalachia is steeped with overt racism. Well, this is everywhere. Racial trauma and racial terrorism is a part of the fabric of the United States of America. The land that we sit on and we occupy is a result of racial terrorism and racial trauma that we have yet to really be able to address and to mitigate and to restore harm from. So when we're talking about how to serve our LGBTQ plus youth, we have to understand all of these factors in play. So another vocabulary check, racial equity. And since this segment is not just about LGBTQ plus identities, this is also about when they intersect and interlock with all different other factors. And this is a great pictorial illustration, right, to really define the difference between equality and equity. You know, we often strive for equality, right? You know, in elementary school and preschool, we were taught this mantra, well, we're just gonna treat everyone the same. Treat everyone the way that you want to be treated. Well, that's a very equality standpoint. And although pie in the sky, we really want to strive for equality, we must start with equity. And equity, you can think of it almost like this pictorial illustration, being able to level the playing field based on the unique experiences of the individuals involved. It is like, for example, I wear a size 10 and a half, 11 shoe. And I'm taller, I'm almost 5'10". So Natalie may wear, let's say, an 8 and a half. If I gave Natalie my 10 and a half shoes, and we were walking to Walmart together, and all of a sudden the Chihuahua just popped out of nowhere, and we had to hightail it to our vehicle. Who would be able to run without stumbling? Probably be me, because the shoes fit me. The shoes are my size. They're not Natalie's size. But if we give everyone a pair of shoes that fits them, then we're able to achieve some equity. They're still receiving a pair of shoes, but actually fits them and their needs. And that's all that embodies racial equity. Racial equity is acknowledging that we have systems at play that have unfortunately disenfranchised certain populations due to race. due to his history of oppression, due to the fact that we have felt it very comfortable to say someone looks different, so they should be treated differently. And you can move forward. Oh, that was me. So there's some examples of trauma. And Natalie did a great job talking about some of the traumas that our youth experience. But one of those traumas we don't talk a lot about because it's uncomfortable for us is racial trauma. We don't talk about homophobia as a form of trauma because it is. Queerphobia, transphobia as a form of trauma. But we also don't talk about individuals that experience all of these traumas together, that may also be experiencing racial trauma, queerphobia, transphobia, shame, food and housing insecurity, political and economic trauma, intimate partner violence and family violence, all of those in one shell. But it's easy for us to say that we're going to tap into one area while still negating the fact that there's other forms of trauma that they're experiencing. And we know that trauma is not just individually, it's interpersonally, so how we interact with other people, and collective. So the mass experience. And we can't negate the fact that we have some mass trauma occurring in our society. Just recently, we just received a verdict from Derek Chauvin that he was guilty on all accounts for the death of George Floyd. Shortly afterwards, we got news that there were also other instances of individuals dying from police enacted violence. That's collective trauma. A lot of individuals and a lot of communities are experiencing this. We have our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities that are also experiencing a collective trauma, increased uptick of hate crimes. So when you compound that with being LGBTQ+, that's a different level of experience. But it also takes for us to show up authentically and say that people are more than just what meets the eye, and their experiences are way more than just what meets the eye. We know all of this is essential because there's a cycle of experiences when it comes to trauma. We know that there could be this exposure of trauma, exposure to racism, exposure to homophobia and transphobia, all in the same body, which will cause an increased hypervigilance of risky behaviors, involvement in criminal justice systems, and also additional traumatic experiences due to that. It becomes a cycle and this interwoven aspect that our youth are grappling with. That sometimes it's very easy for us to say, well, we're just going to give them housing. Well, they still need some other supports as well too for the other traumas as well that they're experiencing. We will give them a family support in out-of-home services. Well, they also need other support when it comes to the racial trauma that they've experienced, the LGBTQ+ aspect of oppression. Because if we satisfy one without also dealing with the other aspects, then we're shortchanging our youth. We're not being able to service them in their whole selves. And I say all of this to really build up to this aspect of LGBTQ+ youth of color. One of those aspects that sometimes we're uncomfortable in naming, that their experiences can be vastly different than individuals that are white. Because we know that LGBTQ+ youth of color are the most impacted by child welfare and juvenile justice. We know that LGBTQ+ youth of color are more likely to enter back into juvenile justice systems and child welfare systems. We know that LGBTQ+ youth of color tend to remain longer and face greater risk of discrimination and violence compared to peers in juvenile justice, child welfare spaces. We know that they're more impacted by HIV, STDs, and AIDS. Reported victimization are lower rates for LGBTQ plus youth of color. Compounding, like Natalie mentioned, there's already this view and this fear that they're going to be discriminated against as being LGBTQ plus. So compound that with the fact that there are racial aspects to policing that increase the ability to be victimized by the police even when asking for help. That there are people that get murdered and get killed for asking for help because they are perceived as being the problem. And this multiple consciousness in the forms of trauma increases the likelihood of developing severe mental health and symptoms of these oppressions and the inability to thrive within those intersections. And in particularly, only 19% of Black African-American LGBTQ plus youth report that they can be themselves at home, with higher rates of abandonment, sexual attacks, and rapes than their white peers. A special note that's not in the statistic, but we know that the Black community happens to be often the most highly religious and sometimes more conservative population. There are polls that indicate that individuals of the Black community are often more church affiliated. Indianapolis happens to be the city of churches that has some of the most churches per capita in the United States. And they did some research, over 70% of Black population in Indianapolis are religiously affiliated, compared to 56% of white populations being church affiliated. And we know that not all churches are created equal. We know that there are LGBTQ plus affirming churches, but we also know that there's a struggle point for our communities within faith-based organizations. So when we're talking about abandonment, when we're talking about not being able to access the ability to thrive and being able to access the ability to access God, that's also a form of trauma. And over 90% of Black LGBTQ plus youth have experienced racial trauma, meaning that is another intersecting force. And we know all of these aspects also to equate in unsafe environments in the school. We know that, and I won't go over all of these stats, we'll send you these stats, but approximately 57.6% of our LGBTQ plus youth felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation, and 43.3% felt unsafe because of their gender expression. We know that based on all of these aspects, and even that stat at the bottom, of 56.2% of a report hearing homophobic remarks from teachers and other school staff. Can you imagine going into a space and we're taught that our educators and our teachers and our school staff are the ones that have our back, but also to be the problem as well too. We have to shape that. We have to change that experience for our LGBTQ plus youth. We know that's greater, especially for our LGBTQ plus of color, especially if they're in communities where there's not many people of color, or they're in schools where there are not many teachers of color, where those biases tend to facilitate the way individuals are treated. These are some more stats, and just being able to just really understand the gravity of this. This transcends what we really have been focusing on within our schooling. We should be creating safe environments within schooling in the way that we are providing safe spaces for our LGBTQ plus youth. We also know that family trauma is an issue, and it definitely intersects with our youth of color. We know that 33% of our LGBTQ plus youth said that their family is not accepting. We know that about half said that they had an adult in their family that they could actually turn to. And all of these aspects also disproportionately impact individuals of color, like mentioned, that have a higher rate of abandonment by their family. So what do we do? How do we create these LGBTQ plus affirming and empowering child welfare spaces? How do you utilize the power and privilege of you being in the space where you're in, where you can actually enact some changes and some support? Well, we have to affirm. We have to take a stance. And that means that we have to assess our current practices, and as hard as it may be, because sometimes we're so comfortable, because that's tradition. That's what we've been doing for so long. We have to assess our current practices of how we handle our youth in our LGBTQ plus community. We must create family reunification plans that involve an education plan, that involve LGBTQ plus aspects to it. We have to foster an empowering environment through policy and practices and protocol. And we also have to include the ability for youth to self-identify instead of us identifying them for themselves. We also have to recruit LGBTQ plus affirming and culturally responsive families. And we also have to mitigate harm through mental health and support services. But I wanted to focus on two of these aspects. One is within this affirm, is to include the ability for youth and families to self-identify. When we are practicing, and this may be something rhetorical, or you can use the chat as well too, or the Q&A section. When we are doing our practice, who do we leave out? And who we leave out matters for our youth. Are we giving the ability for our youth to have their lived name or their chosen name being pronounced, being able to be affirmed in our spaces? Do we give the ability for our youth to share their pronouns and for it to be adequately utilized? Do we allow our youth to name their race and ethnicity for themselves based on what they identify as versus what we may see them as? I identify as Black. My grandfather was Bosnian. So I could technically say that I was multiracial if I wanted to, and that would be okay for me to do so. But I choose to also identify as Black because that is my salient identity. That's something that empowers me as well too. But also for our families that we work with, do we allow for individuals to be affirmed in their family makeup and their partner identifiers? In addition, that aspect about how do we mitigate harm? Are we using transformative justice practices? And if you're not sure what transformative justice is, please feel free to do some research or reach out to me. Transformative justice is a way to mitigate harm and conflict. It allows for an affirming and a survivor-centered. And also, are we suggesting and do we have resources where we are referring cultural affirmations programs? Do we have a list of affinity groups that individuals can tap into? Especially in these rural communities that can be the hollers, may not have necessarily the resources like an Indianapolis or a South Bend may have. But there's some sun and rainbow to all of this. And we know that the key to the success for our LGBTQ plus youth, and in particularly youth of color and intersectionalities, is resilience. But this requires that they have some available, stable, caring adults and support systems. That may be you. You may be the caring and support system for our LGBTQ plus youth, and particularly youth of color. Have a sense of mastery over their life and circumstances, have strong executive function over their self-regulation skills, and affirming faith in cultural traditions? Do we affirm it? Or do we like to ignore the fact that we are working with a Black child and they may have some racial elements to their care and experience that we need to affirm? So we do have some community responsibility in this, and this is really how we can support our youth. We have to be healing-centered engaged. We have to utilize everything that Natalie told us about the experiences, about understanding the LGBTQ plus youth community, but also understanding those intersectional aspects to be more than trauma-informed. Because we know that trauma-informed is talking about the individual aspect, but it's also rooted in harm-centered work. Being healing-centered engaged allows us to say that we're going to be affirmational. We're going to look at the ability for individuals to fight adversity through the best parts of themselves. And it's reframing that narrative. It's being able to be holistic, but it's being collectively rooted and healing-centered through affirming their culture, not ignoring it just because we're uncomfortable. It's reframing the question and then shifting that essential question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you to what's right with you. Sometimes we get so fixated on the traumatic aspects of someone's existence. When we talk about race, when we talk about LGBTQ plus community, we are fixated and we consume the trauma involved. But what we don't talk about is the amazing affirmational aspects, the amazing culture, the amazing differences that make them a super group to be with. And our LGBTQ plus youth, they need to hear that. They need to hear that they are collectively a part of something great. And that's our responsibility. So in order to have best practices, we have to be culturally grounded in our approach. We have to use identity and culture as a tool for affirmation to ground them. We have to be centered in healing, not just pointing out the pain, but also creating steps that allow for healing and understanding the role of intersectionality in that as well too. But we also have to use inclusive language. We have to humanize people. And when they say they want to be named or called a certain name or pronoun, that's our role and responsibility to provide that. Just more information, making sure that when we're creating a child welfare system, we want to utilize transformative justice and restorative justice as a lens to create greater community, to mitigate trauma. And we also want to serve the whole child. We want to be intersectional in our approach. We want to also consider, especially if you all are working for agencies, if you all are working for your own selves or companies or doing casework, do you all have an inclusive language policy? Do you have a chosen name policy? Are you considering the policy and practices and protocols that are in existence that sometimes can cause a breach and can exacerbate conditions? So, as Natalie was getting to as well in our previous PowerPoint, there are some protective factors. And I'm going to let Natalie go over these because she so amazingly created this aspect.
I know we're getting really close to time, or we're supposed to be on our panel already. So I'm just going to have you guys look through these, and I know we need to get through that. So also, we'd be happy to send this PowerPoint to anybody that needs it. We want to definitely share that information, but I don't want to leave our panelists hanging. So if Jay wouldn't mind just clicking through that really quick, I just want to share really quick that the support group is open that we run. I don't know if that's on the end of your PowerPoint as well. It should be Jay. You already went over all that. There's lots of great resources from glad.org, so check those out. If you could go to the next one. There's some great resources there too, but also Pride Initiative, if you go to the next one, is my group that I run. We do not need anything. We have a grant. You can just literally show up. You just need to send me your email, or if anybody that wants to participate can just send an email. We're doing it via Zoom on Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. So really, literally, we have a person that's coming from Texas that attends that group with us. We also have an in-person group at 7:30 in the Crown Point office, but you guys can email me for that. But I do want to introduce the panel. Hello, panel. Thank you for being so patient and waiting for us. I'd like to introduce Lewis. Lewis, would you like to say hi and just give yourself a brief introduction?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lewis Niebuhr. Thank you for having me. I'm
Yes,
looking
thanks.
forward to talking.
Great. And Chochi?
Hi, I'm Shochi. I'm Mexican American. I use they, them pronouns. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Why don't we have Lewis, if we don't mind, if you wouldn't mind sharing it. We've really had the panel come today, and then Jay is also on our panel. Jay, I know everyone knows you already, but I just wanted to have everybody come and share today maybe some of their own childhood experiences of what it was like for them being as an LGBTQ person or a queer person. If you wouldn't mind sharing. Do you want to go first, Lewis?
Sure, thanks. Gosh, I really enjoyed this presentation, though. I have to say, I've learned so much, and it's been really great. I mean, the whole idea of acknowledging privilege, and I want to make sure I do that right up front. Especially, I'm coming to you guys from Northern Nevada, and where I've really committed myself to an anti-racist life and future. And I feel like here we are, where I'm zooming to you guys from is the traditional homeland of the Northern Paiute, Washoe, and Shoshone people. And it's one of those things where my country's worked so hard to get rid of these people for hundreds of years. And it's so important to acknowledge that fact. And that, again, my whiteness is a part of my identity that I should not deny, but it does help me to acknowledge the privilege, especially listening to the discussion of intersectionality. And I'm a college professor, so I deal with people from all over, lots of different kinds of intersectionalities, and it's been so important to me. I think my gayness, right, because that's the term I grew up using, has really helped, I think, give me an understanding of the acknowledgement of my privilege, for one thing, right? To help me acknowledge that, and also to be more aware that, oh, this person has a lot going on, right? There are a lot of things, a lot of different intersectionalities that I think I need to understand and really work to understand all the time. I remember, Natalie, you asked me to talk a little bit about my childhood. The bullying that started the first day of kindergarten and didn't end until, graduation of high school. I mean, the continual everyday bullying. And I think a lot of that happened because I didn't have any other identities. There was this sort of gay identity, I suppose. That was the only option in the 80s when I was growing up. You had straight, and then you had this gay thing. And I think I connected with that because it was the only option. I am, gay. That's the identity I embraced. I think, but trying to find my tribe was really difficult when growing up. I remember hearing my parents say, I was sitting in the back seat. I must have been in first grade or so. And my parents are very loving, but I remember my mom saying to my dad, "No, you don't need to worry. He's not one of those. He makes fun of them just like you do," right? And the fact that I remember this, and I remember thinking at the time, they must be talking about how different I am, right? From their expectations of the way I was supposed to be. My parents are super loving, but my dad, my dad's a cop, ex-Marine. He had a very set idea of the way boys grow up. And I wasn't those things, but I also didn't fit into a lot of the gay stereotypes because I was a super nerd, and I always assumed that was what they didn't like about me, right? That I was not into sports because I was into science fiction and I was into, all those kinds of things. But this is why I didn't fit into the gay stereotype either, because I wasn't the stereotypes of being into fashion and being, do you know what I mean? And being flamboyant, that wasn't me either. So that's what I think part of the alienation I felt was from not knowing where I fit in. And it wasn't until college, and this is another point of acknowledging my privilege, the fact that I was able to go away to college, to be away from that traumatic Catholic upbringing, right? Where every day in school, you're being told how awful you are. Every day you're being bullied by your peers, and then go away to college and say, okay, I'm going to change my name. I'm going to completely redefine who I am. And this is the person I'm going to present to myself, even if it's not fully formed at 18, right? I can create a person But see, even then though, in the 80s, I remember in college going to get my first HIV test, going to the what do you call it, the student health or whatever, and the nurse coming in and saying, so how can we help you today? You know, seeing me, a nice white guy, clear white college student. And I said, I'd like to get an HIV test, and seeing the blood just go out of her face and essentially run out of the room, leaving me there for a half hour, and then overhearing this argument happening outside saying, I'm not going in there with him. I'm not going to get AIDS, right? What do you think I am? I don't deal with these people. And thinking, oh, that's still a thing, right? This is a thing, people's ignorance, even in the medical profession. And the fact that my parents sent me to therapy when I was 15 because I wore black clothes, right? And again, that's my struggle, figuring out who I am, what my identity is, how my gayness fits in with a peer group, any peer group at all, right? There were no peer groups. There were no gay kids, really. There were like one or two that I had nothing in common with. So I found myself sort of attaching myself to the punk scene because they were the only ones that embraced anyone different. But again, so my parents sent me to therapy, and luckily, I had a therapist who was like, why are you here? Do you know what I mean? I mean, are you here because of your gayness? Like, I don't think so. Your parents told me that that's why you're here. I'm like, okay, so let's talk about boys. So we just talked about boys. I mean, luckily I had this great therapist who just kind of saw the ridiculousness of it and did not pathologize me, which was really great. Anyway, that's sort of me in a little
Thanks,
nutshell.
Louis.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I
No,
rambled.
that's great. No, I really appreciate that. That was great to hear that about that experience that you had. I just want to make sure I give Chochi some time. Chochi, did you want to share? Thanks, Louis.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting to hear because I'm also kind of a gay dude. So yeah, I'm Chochi. I identify as gender fluid and gay. Dealing with the feeling of like isolation due to who I am as a person is still something that I go through like every day. I live in a very white dominated area, and as I stated, I'm Mexican American. I identify as half indigenous, but due to the effects of colonization, me and my family, we don't really know what nation or tribe we descend from. So dealing with the effects of like not really knowing like exactly who we are, but also not fitting in with like the general like population out here, that's something that I encounter every day. And even being LGBTQ makes it a little bit harder too, because there's so few of us who I've seen at least that fully own who they are and are themselves without apologizing for it. Because so many of us have like a religious upbringing, and that can really stifle, creativity with gender and expression and stuff like that. So yeah, during like my school years, I was always like maybe like one of like two Latino kids in my class, and that would be in like a class of like 30 to 40 students sometimes. So I would be hearing like all the kids be like saying slurs and stuff, and I would be like, that's not something I vibe with. So yeah, I just like never really fit in, and due to me coming out when I was like 14 fully, that bullying like really impacted me. Teachers would not be the best. They would I don't want to say they would have said things that would have gotten them fired, but they would frequently do stuff like that, if that's okay to say. Yeah, the environment was not the best, and I ended up dropping out when I was 17, I think, a few days before my 17th birthday. I dropped out, and since then I've just been like trying to find my place in the world, find some friends who have similar experiences to myself. Yeah, I mean, I'm only 21, so I don't have a whole life story to give yet, but I hope that's good.
No, it's very valuable. Thank you. I love hearing the different perspectives. I mean, that's the whole point of having a panel, right? Is to hear different perspectives. And I think it's great how everyone was able to tie it into the topic that we're talking about today and how that's personally affected you. I think that's really helpful and purposeful for today's session. Jay, I would like to open to you too, because I know you're an official member of this panel as well. Is there any childhood experiences that you would like to share?
Yeah, so I grew up in the hollers of Eastern Kentucky, to very conservative sharecropping family, and we lived on a farm. And my grandparents were, although very conservative, they were also just very welcoming. But I will not say that my external community was that way. You know, there was a lot of racial terrorism and trauma that I experienced. And I had to, especially as a youth, talking to my mom and my family, it was really the narrative is, do you want more trauma than you already experienced? Pick your level of trauma. Do you want more? So I consumed that, and I consumed that for years, probably until into high school, where I was like, you know what, I'm about to go to college, so I'm really, you know, I'm okay. So, but I know I had that privilege to be able to have a mom that when I told her that that's how I'm going to operate, that she was like, okay. But the fact that I had to even just kind of consume that initially and say I had to pick a trauma or a level of trauma, I still get that narrative to this day, especially friends that are people of color, friends that are not people of color, that said, you know, why, especially since as femme that you can be, I can be very femme and very masculine at times, femme as you can be, why would you choose to further your trauma and your experience? Don't you know how dangerous it is for you not only being a Black woman, but you're saying that you're choosing to be a queer woman? And I'm like, well, it's not a choice. I don't like that language of choice, you know. It's not like I'm trying it on like a hat. So, you know, I don't really like that language. It's very oppressive language, but it also is a symptom of our racial history as well, too, of how pervasive racism is in our community, in our society, that I'm not afforded the luxury to be queer. I'm not afforded the luxury of being myself because I have a lot already on my shoulders right now. And that's how I had to operate in my childhood.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you all of my panelists for trusting us with all that. It's really a privilege. Thank you. I would like to, we have a couple questions. We have one for Chochi, if that's okay. You feel comfortable answering at whatever level. They were asking, have your parents been supportive? They also made a statement that you're beautiful and God made you and loves you, Chochi. But the question was, were your parents supportive of you?
First of all, thank you for the beautiful comment. That's very touching. Yeah, so I only have a mom. My father passed away before I came out as anything. So I came out as several different things. And in the beginning, my mom was angry and then confused and then begrudgingly accepting. And now she's on my side. She's my ally. I owe pretty much everything to her. So yeah.
Thanks, Chochi. I'd like to ask all the panelists if you guys had to talk about anything that you wanted to take away from today or anything that you think that the audience here should know. What do you think would be the most important thing that if you had to, I know it's hard to choose one thing, but if you were going to choose something, what do you think that would be today? Whatever order you guys like to go in.
I'll go. I think I don't know if there's anybody in this panel or anybody in the audience as old as me, right? I'll be 50 in a month. But I think the most inspiring thing for me was Jay's comment, or what she said, I don't like being put in a box. And that freedom that young people have today, that I certainly didn't have growing up, I think is just beautiful. And the idea of that, you know, of this incredible spectrum, taking that away from today, and things I encounter in my students all the time, it just constant, like, questioning the whole idea of gender and identity has just been really amazing. And watching that happen has been something I wish I had the advantage of growing up, definitely.
Thanks, Louis. Chochi?
Yeah, I feel that also very similar to what Jay said and what Louis mentioned is the most useful interactions that I've had with the community, not only in LGBTQ specific spaces, but also just like in the general world, is have been when they choose not to use gendered language for myself specifically, because that's always helpful, but for anyone in general, because you never know when someone could be feeling a certain way, someone could be identifying a certain way, and, you know, just trying to be neutral and inclusive is probably the best way of going forward with interacting with people if you don't know them.
Great, thank you. It is something that takes practice. So everyone give yourself some grace and kindness about that, but it definitely takes practice. I started saying that person or they try almost exclusively because of I'm privileged with my practice that I do, and I work with a lot of people that have that are not binary or other things, and so it makes me more aware of that, but it does take practice, so kindness to self. Jay, any
can I
thoughts?
ask a question? Sorry,
Sure.
Can I ask a follow about that? And that's,
Yeah.
I have a lot of students who come from the South where using titles are super important, like Mr. and Miss and all those things. And if you don't know somebody's preferred pronouns, we're dealing with two different things. Like, you don't want to offend somebody by not being formal to your elders, and at the same time, you don't want to assume anything at the same time. And it's so tricky to know what to do in those situations. I saw somebody in the thing saying, what do we do in these kinds of complicated situations with pronouns and titles?
Yeah, that's a big one, especially since, you know, I grew up in a household with yes ma'ams and no ma'ams and no sirs. I have especially evolved over time to just say yes, or instead of saying the ma'am and the sir, just to say yes or hello. I use folks. Folks tends to be a very inclusive. I say, especially when I'm doing honorifics, I make sure to confirm with the person of how they would like to be named as well too. If you have that privilege to know how they would like to be named. Some people don't like Miss in front of their name or Mr. Sometimes they'll put Mix, MX, instead. And just to confirm as well too. So if you have that opportunity to ask first, then it also will allow you a way to pivot. When I'm out there in the community and I am receiving an order, I also sometimes use a disclaimer. I say I'm Southern. So if I say yes, ma'am, or no, sir, and I'm telling you, I'm misgendering you, you call me in, you tell me. And just the fact that, and I think this is important to just note, like Natalie said, give yourself some grace. That our folks, they want us to show up for them, but they also want the courtesy of just asking as well too. We're not always requiring perfection, but at least an acknowledgement that harm potentially could have been caused, and a way to address that as well too.
And I think we're out of time. I just want to address a couple things really quick. I had somebody post something as a question that their husband grew up in another country, and they always felt they didn't fit, even though they're not LGBTQ. I mean, I think it's so important to acknowledge that there are people that, you know, they said their daughter felt like they never fit in. So, I mean, I think this intersectionality topic is so important. And I hope we get to do more on it. But I thank you so much for sharing that. And then we also had a person really quick saying they noticed that Jay and I both mentioned dressing masculine. And I think, you know, they said that they grew up in a conservative Christian church and that women had to wear skirts and dresses. So I think, again, that's kind of touches on that intersectionality on the way that things are perceived. And they were wondering what we consider to be dressing masculine. I mean, I guess for me, I wear t-shirts with superheroes on them all the time, you know, with jeans. So that's masculine, more masculine than I think my mother would have liked, right? I guess is what I'm saying, right? Not that she was particularly bossy about what I wore, but certainly not as feminine. If I was going to go to something formal, I could not wear pants, right?
Yeah, I would think of masculine and feminine as very socially constructed expressions. And socially, we have constructed that a masculine attire for me is I wear often men labeled jeans. I often wear men labeled suits with bow ties. I often wear men labeled shoes as well too. But I'm very androgynous. So I also wear very feminine clothes that are socially constructed feminine, that I wear skirts and dresses and heels and lipstick and makeup. And sometimes I do a combination of both, that I may wear a full beat makeup face of MAC with a masculine suit on. And that's comfortable for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay. So I think we need to hand it over to the other folks. And I want to thank everybody for coming. And we do have some closing statements by our friendly folks that are running today. So I'll hand it over to them. And again, thank you panelists for coming, and thank you so much everybody for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you for all those who joined us. You know, this has been a really important topic, and we appreciate the time that you spent, and we hope you came away with some very valuable information.